"Thank you to the nurse," he said, voice thick with grief, as if he'd practiced it in front of the mirror until it sounded like love. The church was full of lilies and quiet coughing. Black coats brushed against wooden pews. Someone's phone buzzed once and got silenced fast, like shame. I stood near the front with my hands folded over each other, the way I'd learned to hold myself when I didn't know where to place my feelings. 12 years of my life were sitting in that casket. Her son, Graham, kept his eyes on the floor as people lined up to offer condolences. He nodded, swallowed, nodded again. The pastor spoke in soft phrases about devotion and dignity. I listened, but my mind kept drifting to the last time I had washed Eleanor Whitfield's hair, warm water running through silver strands, her chin tucked like a child's as I rinsed the soap from her scalp. When the service ended, Graham stepped to the front to say a few words. His hands trembled around the paper. His voice cracked once. And then, like a knife turning slowly, he smiled toward the crowd and said it again. "Thank you to the nurse who took care of her." He scanned the room. His eyes landed on me. He blinked, as if trying to place an object he'd left somewhere years ago. Then, in front of everyone, neighbors, cousins, old friends, he leaned closer and asked, almost politely, "And you are?" My mouth went dry. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. Thought grief had made his words tumble wrong. But his face was earnest. Confused. Like my name was simply a detail he hadn't needed. I stared at him, my throat tight, and the world narrowed to that one question. 3 simple words that carried 12 years of erasure. And that's when I understood something painful and true. Some people remember your service, but forget your sacrifice. Before I take you back to how we got here, tell me where you're watching from. And if you've ever been the one holding everything together for everyone else, quietly, invisibly, tap like and subscribe and stay with me. Because what happened next wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. But it changed the way I saw love forever. I'm 72 now, living in a small townhouse in Savannah, Georgia, where the air always carries some mix of salt and jasmine. My hands ache when it rains. My knees complain on stairs. And yet the memory of that day, Graham's blank eyes, his question, still has the power to make me sit up straighter in my chair. Back when it all began, I was 31 and newly married. I had moved with Graham from Columbus, Ohio, to Savannah for his job. He was ambitious in that steady, reliable way that made people trust him. He wore crisp shirts and talked about building a future. I worked part-time at a pediatric clinic, and in the evenings I cooked meals that made the house smell like home. Garlic, butter, simmering tomatoes, the quiet comfort of something warm waiting on the stove. Eleanor Whitfield, his mother, was still strong then. Sharp tongue, quick mind, the kind of woman who could cut you down with a single look and then hand you a slice of pie as if nothing happened. The first time I met her, she wore pearls even in the afternoon, and she held my hand just long enough to test my grip. "So you're the one," she said, eyes moving over me like a seamstress inspecting a hem. Graham laughed nervously. "Mom." Eleanor smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We'll see." I should have been offended. Instead, I tried harder. I brought her groceries when she complained the store was too loud. I listened when she told stories about Graham as a boy, how he never liked his peas, how he used to fall asleep with one sock on. I laughed at her jokes even when they stung. I told myself it was normal. Mothers and daughters-in-law always needed time. Then, 3 years into our marriage, Eleanor fell in her kitchen and broke her hip. It started like that. A single phone call. Graham pacing the living room with his hand in his hair. The hospital smell clinging to our clothes when we finally came home near midnight. "She can't be alone," he said, voice strained. Not now. I remember standing at the sink, rinsing blood-colored cough syrup off a spoon, and feeling something settle in my chest. Duty, maybe. Or the belief that this was what marriage meant, taking on what your spouse carried, even when it was heavy. We'll figure it out, I said. And we did. At first, it was temporary. A few weeks. A couple of months. Physical therapy appointments. Medication schedules taped to the fridge. I learned how to lift her without hurting her back. I learned which pills made her nauseous. I learned how to cook softer foods when her jaw ached. I learned her fears, the ones she didn't say out loud, the ones that came in the night when the house went quiet and she couldn't pretend she wasn't afraid. Graham helped. At first. He drove her to appointments when he could. He paid bills. He kissed her forehead and told her he loved her. Then he returned to work. He returned to meetings. He returned to life. And slowly, without any conversation where it was agreed upon, Eleanor's care became mine. It happened in small, invisible ways. Graham would say, "You're better with her." Or, "She listens to you." Or, "I don't know how you do it, Lena." Lena. That's what he called me then. Marlene Whitfield, but he shortened it the way lovers do. Lena. At first, those words felt like appreciation. Later, they felt like a hand pushing responsibility into my lap and walking away. But I didn't complain. Because Eleanor needed me. Because Graham looked tired. Because everyone always tells women like me that caring is what we're made for. And for years I believed them. The years folded into each other so quietly that I barely noticed when my own life began to shrink around hers. Eleanor moved from the spare bedroom to the one closest to the bathroom. Then the walker appeared. Then the raised toilet seat. Then the pill organizer with its neat little doors labeled by day. I learned the rhythm of her breathing at night, the sound that meant she was sleeping peacefully and the one that meant pain was stirring again. I learned how to wake before dawn without an alarm, how to listen for the creak of her floorboard before she called my name. Graham used to say, "You're incredible, Lena. I don't know how you manage all this." I smiled when he said it. I wanted to believe it meant something. My days became small and full at the same time. I woke early, made oatmeal just the way Eleanor liked it, thin, with a pinch of salt. I helped her bathe, careful to keep my voice light so she wouldn't feel embarrassed. I rubbed lotion into her legs when the skin grew dry and papery. I learned which of her stories she wanted to tell again and which ones hurt too much to touch. Some afternoons she was kind. Other days, sharp as a blade. "You cut the apples too thick," she'd snap. "You folded that wrong. I don't like that shirt on you." I told myself it was the pain talking. Or fear. Or age. And sometimes it was. But sometimes it was simply who she was. Still, I stayed. Graham worked longer hours. Promotions came. Travel followed. He'd kiss my cheek on the way out and say, "I don't know how you do it," like a compliment that also closed the door behind him. I told myself this was marriage. That love meant endurance. That I was strong enough to carry what he couldn't. Years passed that way. When Eleanor's mind began to slip, the house grew quieter but heavier. She would forget my name, then remember it again. She would mistake me for her sister, or her mother, or sometimes a stranger who had wandered in uninvited. One evening, as I helped her into bed, she looked up at me with sudden clarity and said, "You didn't have to stay, you know." I paused, one hand still on the blanket. "Yes," I said softly. "I did." She studied my face as if trying to memorize it. "My son. He doesn't see things the way you do." I didn't answer. I just smoothed her hair and turned off the lamp. By then, my own world had narrowed to the size of that house. Friends drifted away after too many declined invitations. My job at the clinic became part-time, then occasional. I stopped buying new clothes because there was nowhere to wear them. My reflection aged faster than I expected, lines deepening from worry and interrupted sleep. Graham noticed none of it. He would come home late, loosen his tie, and ask, "How was she today?" in the same tone someone might ask about the weather. Some nights, I wanted to scream. Other nights, I wanted to disappear. Most nights, I simply folded laundry in silence and listened to the house settle. There were moments of tenderness, too. Eleanor squeezing my hand when the pain spiked. Whispering, "You're good," when she thought I was asleep. Those moments kept me going longer than they should have. The first real fracture came the winter she stopped recognizing me altogether. She called me the helper now, or the girl. Sometimes she asked if I was being paid. One afternoon, as I was spoon-feeding her soup, she frowned and said, "Do you live here?" The spoon trembled in my hand. "Yes," I said gently. "I've lived here a long time." She nodded slowly, then looked past me. "My son will know what to do." Something inside me tightened at that. That night, after she'd gone to sleep, I found Graham in the kitchen scrolling through his phone. "She doesn't know who I am anymore," I said quietly. He sighed. "That's the disease, Lena." "I know," I said. "But it's getting harder. I could use some help." He looked up, just briefly. "What kind of help?" "I don't know. Maybe a nurse. Even part-time." He frowned. "Those are expensive." "So is burnout," I said before I could stop myself. He stared at me, surprised by the edge in my voice. Then he softened. "You're better with her than anyone else. She's comfortable with you." The words landed heavy. A compliment shaped like a cage. I nodded because I always did. And so the years stretched on. 12 of them. 12 years of lifting, washing, waiting. Of learning medications by color and shape. Of sleeping lightly. Of measuring time in pill refills and doctor visits. Of being thanked in passing but never truly seen. By the time Eleanor passed, quietly one early morning while the sun was just beginning to touch the curtains, I felt hollowed out and strangely calm. I held her hand until it cooled. I closed her eyes. I called Graham. He arrived an hour later, shaken and pale. He cried in the hallway, his shoulders heaving. I stood beside him, steady, the way I had learned to be. The funeral came quickly after. And that was when he forgot my name. But that moment, sharp and humiliating as it was not the beginning of my breaking. It was the beginning of my waking. The days after the funeral moved strangely, as if time itself had lost its edges. People brought casseroles I didn't remember asking for. Cards arrived with handwriting I barely recognized. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, their eyes full of sympathy that slid past me and settled on Graham instead, as if grief was something that belonged to him alone. I stood beside him through it all, dressed in black, my hands folded the way they had been for years. When people hugged me, they said things like, "You were so kind to her," or "She was lucky to have you." No one asked how I was. No one asked what it had cost. After the funeral, back at the house, Graham wandered from room to room like a guest who'd lost his way. He opened drawers, closed them again. He stood in the doorway of his mother's bedroom for a long time, staring at the empty bed. "I don't know what to do now," he said quietly. I almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said, "We'll figure it out." The words came out automatically, trained into me by years of repetition. But something in my chest shifted as I said them, like a thread loosening. The house felt different without Eleanor. Quieter, yes, but also exposed. The routines that had once filled every hour were gone, and in their place was a strange openness I didn't know how to inhabit. The first morning after the funeral, I woke early out of habit. I stood in the kitchen holding a mug of tea that had already gone cold, listening for a call that never came. No footsteps. No cough from down the hall. Just silence. That was when I realized how much of myself I had poured into care, and how little of myself was left untouched. Graham went back to work almost immediately. "I need the distraction," he said, straightening his tie. "Sitting around won't help." I nodded. Of course. It never occurred to him that sitting around was exactly what I'd been doing for 12 years. Waiting, watching, holding everything together. With Eleanor gone, my role became unclear. I tried to talk to Graham one evening as we ate leftovers in front of the television. "I'm thinking about going back to work," I said carefully. "Maybe full-time again." He barely looked up. "At your age." It wasn't cruel. It was casual. Almost curious. "I'm only 62, I replied. He shrugged. "I just mean, you've been out of it a long time. And now that Mom's gone, maybe you should rest." Rest. The word landed like a door closing. I nodded because I always did. But inside, something hardened. A small, quiet resolve I didn't yet have words for. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing things I had once ignored. The way Graham spoke about his house, even though my name was on the mortgage too. The way bills appeared already paid, without discussion. The way he referred to my years of care as what you did for Mom, as if it were a hobby I'd chosen, not a life I'd given. One afternoon, while sorting paperwork from the hospital, I came across a folder I didn't recognize. It had been tucked into the back of a drawer, half hidden behind old manuals. Inside were documents I hadn't seen before. Power of attorney forms. Medical directives. Financial authorizations. My name was there, listed as caregiver. But not as family. Not as spouse. Just caregiver. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, papers spread out in front of me. The house hummed softly around me. The refrigerator clicked on and off. Somewhere outside, a lawnmower droned. Caregiver. That was how I'd been filed away. A role. A function. A convenience. I thought of the years I'd spent bathing his mother, feeding her, advocating for her at appointments, sleeping lightly so I could hear if she called. I thought of the nights I'd cried quietly in the bathroom so no one would hear. Of the way my own life had been put on pause. And still, in ink and legal language, I had been reduced to a category. That night, I asked Graham about it. He looked uncomfortable, then defensive. "That's just paperwork." The lawyer needed something official. Official for what? I asked. For handling things. For convenience. And why wasn't I listed as your wife? He sighed. It didn't matter. It was just easier this way. Easier. The word echoed in me. You never corrected her when she called me the nurse, I said quietly. He frowned. That's not fair. She was confused. And you never corrected anyone else either, I said. Not once. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he said, You're making this into something it isn't. I looked at him then, really looked, and saw something I hadn't wanted to see before. Not cruelty. Not malice. Just a profound, comfortable blindness. I nodded slowly. Maybe I am, I said. But inside, something had shifted again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake listening to the clock tick, the house settling, my own breath moving in and out. Memories rose uninvited. Eleanor's hand in mine, Graham's distracted smile, the way my name had disappeared from his mouth long before it disappeared from his memory. I got out of bed and went to the small desk by the window. I pulled out a notebook I hadn't used in years. And I began to write. Not a diary. A list. Dates. Appointments. Medications. Conversations I remembered clearly. Moments when decisions were made without me. Times I was present but unseen. I didn't know yet what I would do with it. I only knew that, for the first time in a long while, I was paying attention to my own life. And that felt dangerous. And necessary. The list grew quietly, the way mold does in a dark corner, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore once you know where to look. I didn't write with anger. I wrote with care. Dates. Conversations. Little moments that had once slipped past me because I was too busy being useful to question them. I wrote about the afternoon Graham signed papers without asking me to read them. About the time the bank clerk looked confused when I introduced myself as his wife. About the doctor who spoke only to him while I stood there holding Eleanor's coat. I wrote until my hand cramped, then I stopped and stared at the page, surprised by how calm I felt. This wasn't revenge. It was clarity. In the weeks that followed, something subtle changed in me. I began to notice how often Graham assumed, rather than asked. How often he spoke about me instead of to me. How he referred to my mother's care, as if I hadn't been the one delivering it, hour by hour. One evening, while I was folding laundry, he said casually, "I spoke to the lawyer today." I looked up. About what? About the estate. Now that Mom's gone, there are a few things to straighten out. The way he said it, tidy, efficient, made my chest tighten. "Did you want me there?" I asked. He hesitated, just long enough to answer honestly without meaning to. "It wasn't necessary." I nodded, slowly. Of course. That night, I lay awake listening to his breathing, steady and untroubled. I thought about how many nights I had stayed awake for his mother, counting her breaths, waiting for her to stir. How responsibility had always flowed in one direction. In the morning, I made coffee and watched the steam rise. Then I picked up the phone and called a number I'd saved months ago but never used, the number of a legal clinic a friend had once mentioned, just in case. The woman who answered had a calm voice. She asked my name. She asked how she could help. I told her simply that I had questions. She suggested we meet. I told Graham I had an appointment that afternoon. He didn't ask where. I think by then he had grown used to not asking. The office was small and quiet, with framed certificates and a bowl of mints on the desk. The lawyer, her name was Denise, listened without interrupting as I explained my situation. I told her about the years of caregiving, the paperwork, the way my role had been defined without my consent. She didn't rush me. She didn't look surprised. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "You've been carrying more responsibility than you realize." I swallowed. "I don't want to cause trouble." She gave me a gentle look. "Understanding your rights isn't trouble. It's protection." Those words settled into me like a warm stone. She explained things slowly. What caregiving meant legally. What my contributions counted as. What marriage actually implied, even when people pretended otherwise. She didn't promise miracles. She didn't offer drama. She offered clarity. When I left her office, The air felt different. Sharper. Cleaner. I walked 2 blocks before realizing my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something like relief. At home, Graham was on the phone when I came in, laughing lightly. He ended the call and said, "We should talk later." "We should," I agreed. That evening after dinner, I sat across from him at the table where I had served thousands of meals. My hands rested flat on the wood. I wanted to feel its solidity. "I spoke to a lawyer today," I said. He blinked. "Why?" "To understand where I stand." His jaw tightened. "You didn't need to do that." "I did," I said quietly. He leaned back, exhaling sharply. "This feels unnecessary." I met his eyes. So did being called the nurse at your mother's funeral. Silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable. He looked away first. "I didn't mean it like that," he said. "I know," I replied. "That's part of the problem." I told him what the lawyer had explained, not as a threat, not as a demand, just as information. I watched his expression shift as he realized that the story he'd been telling himself, the one where everything was simple and under his control, had holes in it. "You're making this bigger than it needs to be," he said again, softer this time. "No," I said. "I'm finally seeing it at the size it's always been." He rubbed his face, tired. "What do you want, Lena?" The question hung there, heavy and unfamiliar. I thought about all the years I had answered that question by naming someone else's needs. Eleanor's. Graham's. The house's. This time, I let myself pause. "I want to be seen," I said. "Not thanked. Not praised. Seen." He didn't answer right away. Outside, a car passed, its headlights sweeping briefly across the walls. Somewhere a dog barked, then stopped. Finally he said, "I don't know if I know how to do that." I believed him. And for the first time, instead of shrinking around that truth, I let it stand between us. That night, I returned to my notebook and added a new page. Not a list this time. A sentence. I am allowed to take up space. I wrote it slowly, carefully, as if teaching my hand a new language. And as I closed the notebook, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not triumph, but resolve. Because once you see yourself clearly, it becomes very hard to disappear again. The weeks that followed were quieter, but not peaceful. They carried a different weight, the kind that comes when something long ignored has finally been named, and now refuses to be pushed back into silence. Graham became careful around me. Not kinder, exactly, but cautious. He asked before making plans. He paused before speaking, as if measuring his words. It would have pleased me once. Now it only confirmed how invisible I had been before. I began spending more time out of the house. Long walks in the mornings. Sitting in the small library near the square, where the smell of old paper and lemon cleaner always made me feel steadier. Sometimes I wrote. Sometimes I just watched people come and go, carrying their lives in tote bags and tired expressions. One afternoon, I ran into Mrs. Calder from 3 houses down. She'd known Eleanor for years, had brought casseroles during the worst months. "You look lighter," she said, studying me. "Different." I smiled politely. "Do I?" She nodded, like someone who finally put something down. The words followed me all the way home. That evening, Graham told me his sister was coming to town. Marjorie lived 2 states away and had always managed to be busy whenever their mother needed help. She hadn't come for the funeral either, sent flowers instead. "She wants to talk about the estate," he said, rubbing his temple. "Just to make sure everything's settled." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Am I part of that conversation? He hesitated. I assumed so. Assumed. The word had followed me through my marriage like a shadow. Marjorie arrived 2 days later, brisk and scented with expensive perfume. She hugged Graham tightly, then turned to me with a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, hello," she said. "You must be the caregiver." There it was again. That word. I felt the old instinct rise, to correct her gently, to explain myself carefully, to make her comfortable. Instead I said, evenly, "I'm Lena, Graham's wife." She blinked, clearly recalibrating. "Oh, of course. Sorry." We sat around the dining table where I had once served Eleanor her meals. Papers were spread out now instead of soup bowls. Forms. Statements. Copies of documents I recognized all too well. Marjorie flipped through them briskly. Mother's accounts were fairly straightforward, she said. Most of it was handled through Graham. There's the house, of course. Yes, I said quietly. The house. She glanced at me, then back to the papers. Well, since you were caring for her, I assume there was some arrangement. Something in her tone, polite but edged, made my spine straighten. There was, I said. Graham shifted uncomfortably. Marjorie looked up. And that was... I reached into my bag and placed my folder on the table. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Just carefully. Inside were copies of documents, notes, and records, the same ones I had been organizing for weeks. The ones Denise had helped me understand. The ones that quietly told a fuller story. I was her full-time caregiver for 12 years, I said. Unpaid. Unacknowledged. But documented. Marjorie's eyebrows lifted slightly. I continued, my voice steady. There are records of medical decisions I handled. Appointments I attended alone. Forms naming me as her primary caregiver. Notes in her handwriting. Messages she left for me. Graham stared at the table. I'm not here to take anything that isn't mine, I said. But I won't be erased from the story either. The room went very still. Marjorie flipped through the pages more slowly now. Her expression changed, not to anger, but to something closer to reconsideration. Well, she said finally, this certainly complicates things. I almost smiled. Complicated had been my entire life. The conversation that followed wasn't loud. There were no accusations, no raised voices. Just careful words and long pauses. Clarifications. Questions. Moments where Graham looked at me as if seeing the shape of my life for the first time. At one point he said quietly, I didn't realize how much you did. I met his eyes. That doesn't surprise me. Later that night, after Marjorie had gone to her hotel, Graham sat across from me in the living room. The lamps were low. The house felt tired. I think I owe you an apology, he said. I waited. For taking you for granted. For letting everyone else do the same. His voice was unsteady, but sincere. I nodded slowly. An apology is a beginning. He swallowed. What happens now? I took a moment before answering. I don't know yet, I said. But I know this. I won't disappear again. He nodded, as if accepting a truth he couldn't change. In the days that followed, arrangements were made. Documents revised. Roles clarified. Nothing dramatic. No courtroom scenes. Just quiet corrections to a story that had been written without my consent. I found myself sleeping more deeply. Eating with appetite. laughing sometimes at small things. It surprised me how quickly life responded once I stopped shrinking inside it. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes, I found a photograph from years ago. Eleanor and me on the porch, sunlight on our faces. She was smiling at me in that rare, unguarded way she sometimes did. On the back, in her shaky handwriting, were the words, "She stayed." I sat down on the floor and let myself cry then. Not from pain but from release. Because maybe she had seen me after all. And maybe, in some quiet way, she had understood. The house feels different now. Quieter, yes, but not hollow. There's a difference I've learned to recognize. Quiet can mean absence, or it can mean peace. This one leans toward peace. I sit most mornings at the small table by the window, the one that catches the early light just as it begins to warm the floor. I wrap my hands around a cup of tea and let the steam rise slowly, the way thoughts do when you finally stop pushing them away. My body moves more carefully these days. My knees remind me of every year I spent bending, lifting, waiting. But there is a gentleness in that reminder now, not bitterness. Graham and I live differently together. Not closer. Not colder. Just clearer. He speaks to me more carefully. He asks before assuming. Sometimes he pauses mid-sentence, as if hearing himself for the first time. I don't rush to fill the silence anymore. I let it sit. Let it teach him what it once taught me. We are polite. Respectful. Sometimes even kind. But the shape of us has changed, and I no longer try to press it back into what it was. Some things, once seen, cannot be unseen. I kept the notebook. Not because I need it anymore, but because it reminds me of who I became when I finally chose to pay attention to my own life. It sits in a drawer beside the bed, thin now, its pages filled with small handwriting and steadier truths. I don't add to it anymore. I don't need to. There are days when memory still ambushes me. A smell of antiseptic, the sound of labored breathing, the feel of Eleanor's hand tightening in mine. On those days, I let myself remember her as she was in the quiet moments. The way she hummed old songs when she thought no one was listening. The way her voice softened when she said my name near the end, as if she finally understood what I had been to her. I choose to believe she did. People sometimes ask if I regret staying as long as I did. They mean well. They're looking for a clean lesson, a sharp moral. Something they can carry away neatly. I don't give them one. Because the truth is softer and more complicated than that. I loved in the only way I knew how at the time. I gave because I thought love meant giving until there was nothing left. I confused endurance with virtue, silence with peace, duty with worth. And I don't shame that woman anymore. She did the best she could with what she understood then. But I also honor the woman I became later, the one who learned that care without recognition slowly erases you, and that devotion should never require disappearance. There is a strange kind of power in being underestimated. People stop watching you closely. They stop listening. They assume you will always bend, always adjust, always absorb. And in that quiet space, you begin to see clearly. You notice patterns. You remember details. You learn where the truth hides. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't walk away in a storm of words. I simply stopped shrinking. And in doing so, I reclaimed something that had been slowly slipping away from me for years. Myself. Now, when I walk through the house, I do so with a steadiness I didn't have before. When I speak, I don't rush. When I'm silent, it's because I choose to be. I no longer confuse being needed with being valued. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit on the porch and watch the light fade. Neighbors pass. Cars hum in the distance. Life moves on, as it always does. And I think about how many women carry stories like mine quietly inside them. Years of care, sacrifice, love given freely and remembered faintly, if at all. If you're one of them, I want you to know something. Your quiet does not mean you are invisible. Your patience does not make you small. Your care does not cancel your worth. And if you're listening to this and thinking of someone who gave more than they were ever thanked for, maybe say their name out loud today. Let it be heard. As for me, I am still here. Still breathing. Still learning how to take up space without apology. Still learning that strength does not always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives as a decision, made late at night, in a quiet room, with no audience at all. And if you were me, after all those years of giving, of being overlooked, of being called the nurse instead of by your name, what would you have done next?